Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever it is. This is the first video I've made in a robe or pajamas, actually in a robe, but I've already been up about 2 or 3 hours, walked the dog, came back, took a shower, so it's a really cold, windy day out today. But anyway, we'll get started with this. This is chapter 12. It's called The Pursuit of Perfection. In the PowerPoints, I call it Reform or Reform America, because this is the goal. The goal was to change and to make a more perfect union. Why now? Because originally America was seen as the perfect utopia, the perfect form, an improvement over Europe, particularly in politics, democracy. By the 1830s, 1840s, it was clear that this was not quite the utopia that many people hoped it would be. And this is an attempt to make it more perfect, to go back up to that ideal which the founding fathers started out with. This is very much also a Protestant revival movement. We have these regularly. We had these early in the 1700s, 1830s and 40s. Early 1900s, we had another one. I would say we are probably someplace in the process of another revival movement. Fundamentalist Christians, practicing Christians are on the rise in America while they're on the decline in Europe. For one example, we just elected a conservative Christian as a Supreme Court justice. So this is a movement that comes back regularly in American history. Why 1830s and 40s? Because a lot of people were disillusioned with the ideal of America and trying to improve it. Remember that there is a growing industry, a growing economic change in America. Economic changes bring social changes. There's a lot of unrest. Everybody was a small farmer in 1800. This is no longer true. And democracy, which promised power to the people, was not always coming true. The thing that links all of these different movements and the whole system in the 1830s and 40s was religion, basically. It actually began a little bit earlier. This is called the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening, if you remember, was the early 1700s in New England. This is the second one. And they are trying to escape the fate of Europe. They are trying to become that city on the hill, which many tried to become 100 years earlier. It is very Protestant. It is a movement of camp meetings. And if you look at that second slide in there, you will see what a camp meeting or a tent meeting was. People gathered together. Remember, this is the only show in town, so people came out of curiosity as well. But sometimes thousands of people from hundreds of miles around would come. They would camp out. They would set up tents, and they would listen to preachers day and night, sometimes 24 hours a day, for a week or more. What were they talking about? This is come to Jesus. This is a come to Jesus moment. Save your soul. Come to Jesus and save your soul. Find religion again, or else, and a lot of the time was spent on the or else you will burn in hell, and these are the different ways you will burn. A little bit like the Puritans in that respect. Sometimes 50,000 people would attend these. Remember, there's no megaphones or anything. So you had preachers yelling from stages in different directions, sometimes multiple preachers. Who is it aimed at? Those who are not practicing religion. They are trying to bring them back into the fold. The appeal, of course, is to emotion. This is not a logical movement. This is an emotional movement. Come to Jesus, or I'm going to scare the hell out of you, and this is how you're going to fry in hell forever. Because it was largely an emotional appeal, if you look at that audience in the second slide, you will see there's an awful lot of women there. The stereotype is women are much more emotional than men, and you appeal to their emotions. This certainly worked in the 1830s and 1840s. A lot of them were religious. But unlike the Puritans and predestination, here you had free will. You could change your life. You could come back to Jesus. You could come back to religion, and you could change the trajectory of your life. You had the free will to determine your own fate. You could perfect yourself. You could walk in the steps of Christ, so to speak. And then once you did that, you had to turn around and help perfect society, to help others. This was part of your religious duty, and it was a huge part of this movement. Let me quote one of their mottos: "To the universal reformation of the world, we stand committed." Horace Mann, who revamped education, famously quoted, "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity." It is your Christian duty to go out and improve the world, save yourself, and then go out and make it a better world for others. Key figure here was a man named Charles Finney, and he's the guy who really connected religion to reform, that once you have saved your own soul, you go out and you reform the world, you reform America. He's the Jerry Falwell, the Billy Graham of his times. Huge guy, 6'3", had been a very atheist lawyer before this. He converted. He found Jesus, whatever, and went out and devoted the rest of his life to helping convert others. He believed no true Christian could ignore social problems, and no true Christian could own slaves. So it is out of this movement that we get the Abolitionist Society to abolish slavery, which I will talk about later. This is when many of the churches, particularly the Baptists and Methodists, split into two different branches, northern and southern. Because as this movement swept west, in the northern states, you save your soul, you turn around and you solve social problems. Lots of social problems at the time. In the south, you save your soul, you turn around, you're looking for a social problem. Right in front of your face, unavoidable, was the problem of slavery. So in the South, the movement basically stopped and concentrated on come to Jesus, save your soul. Going out and improving society was not a big movement in the South because you had to deal with slavery, and they were not going to deal with that. So the focus was on individual behavior, not improving society. Okay, slide number 3 gives you some of the very many movements that they were involved in. These people oftentimes were involved in several movements at the same time. Pretty much any kind of social movement we think of today comes out of this period. Factory workers, conditions of factory workers, poverty, the insane, veterans, hospitals, animal rights came out of here. Women's rights came out of this movement. African American rights, you name it, it comes out of this movement. So I'm going to touch on some of the bigger ones, the more interesting ones, and end up eventually with abolition, which swallowed up all the others. So in slide number 3, you see some of the big movements. The movement to create insane asylums, or when I was a kid, as we used to call them, nut houses, which we still do sometimes. This is a movement that comes out of this period as well. The psychology has changed. If you remember the Puritans, everything is determined by God. So if you had an insane family member or somebody went insane, obviously this was God's punishment for sin. Somebody in the family was sinful, or this person was sinful, and God made them crazy or gave you a crazy Uncle Charlie. What did you do with them? Basically, this is where the village idiot comes in. The village took care of their idiots. They fed them, they took them home. If they were truly dangerous, dangerous schizophrenic, for example, murderously dangerous, you tied them up or chained them up in a barn. And as some people said, they were treated worse than the animals in the barn. This changes for the first time in the 1820s and 1830s. The movement was led by a woman, Dorothea Dix, who believed that with a decent environment, with good care and regular habits, one could cure insanity. Horace Mann was also involved with this. There's an interesting portrait, slide number 5, of Horace Mann, who was not the most attractive guy, but who dedicated his entire life to helping others. So, what do you do with them? Instead of chaining them up in a barn, you created insane asylums. If you look at that picture, slide number 4 of a typical insane asylum, it looks vaguely familiar. It should. The same construction companies also made public schools. My school, my elementary and high school in Chicago looked exactly like these buildings, particularly my high school. It could have been a duplicate of that. Also, prisons were made by the same companies. If you notice in that slide, there is a fence around the building, so they're not allowed to wander around. They were confined, but confined for the first time in decent conditions. These were more like hospitals than prisons, basically. They were treated well, they were fed well, they were kept on a regular routine, and the theory was that somehow this would help cure them. Of course, what they didn't have at the time, they didn't have the meds. So mild cases oftentimes improve. This is a schedule that we use for mental illness today, is keeping people on a regular system and under supervision and under simple work programs. We still use this program, but it does not cure serious insanity. There was nothing they could do. They did not have the meds at the time, but it certainly was an improvement over chaining crazy Uncle Harry in the barn for the rest of his life. The second movement, and this is Horace Mann's movement, was public education. He moved on from a committee to help solve mental illness to public education. Started out in politics, left that, was appointed to the Massachusetts School Board, and for 12 years published an annual report. These reports became the basis for the American education system. Okay, you remember Thomas Jefferson. His goal was free public education all the way across the country. Great system, but it is Horace Mann who sat down and actually developed the curriculum. Jefferson had the idea, as he often did. Horace Mann did the footwork for this. In other words, when we go to school today in first grade, we are not taught long division. We are taught phonics. In second grade, we are taught reading simple words. In third grade, we are taught basic addition. Who set up this program? Horace Mann. He set up a curriculum, what should be taught at different ages. It was non-denominational, it was not religious at all, but the goal was to create good, patriotic citizens. And also, as we know, anybody who's taught little kids, quote unquote, civilize the savages, teach them to use a Kleenex when they're going to blow their nose, to sit quietly, to follow orders. Mann's system, what he did himself, is create a national curriculum. It started out in Massachusetts, and then, of course, everybody else adopted it. He wrote a lot of the texts and the materials for it. He designed school buildings and pushed for Massachusetts and later other states to have good educational buildings for children. He set up the first teacher training college and actually developed a curriculum, a course of study to train teachers. Up until this time, how did you become a teacher? Actually, they preferred males because they could whip kids into line. But basically, can you prove you're literate? You can read, fine, you're hired. That was the only criteria. There was no training for teachers. Today, you cannot teach, at least in a public system, any place in America, without having teacher certification. Horace Mann did this. Dirty little secret here. If you teach at a college or university level, you do not need teacher training. All you need is a graduate degree. And this is my own personal opinion, why some college teachers are really great and some are pretty bad. They may know their stuff, but they cannot teach it. They cannot transmit it. They have not gone through the process of a curriculum in how to teach, which is different than your subject matter. Anyway, that's my own private commentary on that. So he sets up a teacher training college and system. He advocated and pushed for better teacher pay. I'm all for that. And he established Antioch College, which was the first college in America to accept women and African Americans. Up till this time, if you were a woman, you don't even apply. for higher education. There was no place that would take you. He also proposed a national preschool, in other words, a Head Start program. That did not get passed. How were you going to pay for it? He proposed taxing the rich a little bit to pay for a universal preschool. But it is Horace Mann's quote, which I think is also very good for America. In a republic, in a democracy, ignorance is a crime. In a democracy, you must have an educated public because they vote. In a kingdom, nobody cares. The king makes the rules. In a democracy, we elect those who make the rules for us. Massachusetts becomes a leader across the country in educational reform. It also began to integrate its houses and integrate its public schools well before the Civil War. When John Quincy Adams died in the middle of an anti-slavery speech in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., Horace Mann took his seat and advocated for education and the abolition of slavery. So he is a huge figure in the reform movement. There are 2 statues outside the State House in Boston, Massachusetts. One is John Adams and the other is Horace Mann. The 2, as the citizens thought at the time, the 2 most important figures that came out of Massachusetts. And Massachusetts set the template for the rest of the country. Whatever Massachusetts did, other states copied. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on women's rights. The book does a reasonable job from that. But women are heavily involved in all of these other movements and began from these other movements to think, wait a minute, maybe we better advocate for our own rights. This is a long history of women's rights. First of all, women on the frontier had equal roles with men and often had a lot of power and often ran farms on their own if their husband was killed or disappeared. Also remember, Puritan women had equal rights and even voted before the Revolution, had equal souls and equal rights. Things change along the way, but there was a long tradition of independent women in America. This is the first time they begin to organize at the end of this reform movement in the 1840s and 1850s. The Grimke sisters, which are further down there in slide number 8, I call them the Grimm sisters. One of them was supposed to be drop dead gorgeous. I don't see that at all. But the 2 of them were heavily involved in the abolition movement, but started out in the women's movement. Wrote a very famous pamphlet that was widely circulated, Letters on the Equality of the Sexes and the Conditions of Women, arguing that women should be treated equally. 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. What do women want? They want the right to vote, and they want legal rights, the right to own, buy, and sell property, and the legal rights to their children. Because up to this time, if you divorced or tried to leave your husband, the husband legally had rights to the children. Children were property. So women want legal rights and the right to vote as well. Okay. Temperance. The next one is the tempering of alcohol. Alcohol becomes a huge issue in America. It is a moral, it is a religious issue because it is a threat to democracy. Drunk people are not good citizens. And alcohol was a very large problem at this time. It is led by the Quakers. The Quakers led a lot of these different movements, and led by women because women are often the victims of alcohol. Why? And during this period, Americans have always been fairly heavy drinkers, not the heaviest, but fairly heavy. But there is a large increase in the consumption of alcohol between 1800 and the Civil War. Average consumption was something like 3 gallons of pure alcohol today. It is no wonder that Alexander Hamilton wanted to tax whiskey, trying to keep down the problems of alcohol. But in this period, right before the Civil War, a couple decades before the Civil War, consumption goes from 3 gallons a year to 6 gallons a year. This is 200 proof per capita. Now, since most women did not drink at all, and there are groups like the Quakers who don't drink at all, some adult males in America are drinking an awful lot of alcohol. This is the equivalent of 34 gallons of beer or cider a year, hard cider. In other words, you're talking several shots a day or 75/5 of whiskey a year. This is pretty hard consumption. Now, they are drinking hard liquor, which is about 50% alcohol, whiskey, not wine, which is about 15%, or beer, which is about 5%. This was a serious, serious problem in America and becoming more so. Reasons: economic changes, a lot of unrest, you have that economic downturn that Andrew Jackson caused. Rapid changes, people are disturbed, people are fearful, they drink. You had taverns that were built next to churches and courthouses. There is a great story of a British traveler who was traveling on a stagecoach through Ohio, who wrote in his journal and Back to Friends, and I'm quoting, "The American stagecoach stops every 5 miles to water the horses and brandy the gentlemen." Anything was an occasion for a drink, any celebration, any event. Having lunch. What did you have with lunch? You had a drink with lunch. You had a drink with dinner. Ben Franklin actually kept a record while he was working a manual job as a young man. And this is when you drank, according to Ben Franklin. 7 a.m. in the morning, you got up, you had some alcohol, like hard cider, with breakfast. 9 a.m., you had a bakery break, they called it. You had a roll, you had some alcohol, hard cider, or they passed a bottle around. 10 a.m., you had a candy break, passed the bottle around. 12, lunch, you had lunch, you had alcohol with it. 3 in the afternoon, you had a break, it was called treating, you passed the bottle around. 4 in the afternoon, you have another candy break, you pass the bottle around. You quit 6 to 7. Where do you go after you quit? You go directly to the tavern and you drink some more. This is an actual record that Ben Franklin kept. So this is a serious problem. 25% of all sales by stores in America were alcohol. 1810, you had, just in New England, 14,000 distilleries producing 5 million gallons a year. New York City, 1,600 licensed cellars, 4,000 saloons, and 111 churches. This is just in New York City. The ratio of saloons to churches is interesting. Civil War comes along, also in the War of 1812. U.S. government issued every soldier per day 4 ounces of whiskey, a good stiff shot of whiskey. So alcohol was a serious problem. Again, why hard liquor? Before the Revolution, it was rum, but rum is made of sugar that was imported, and it's British, and we're not doing that. First of all, it was considered healthy and patriotic. What are they drinking? They are drinking corn whiskey. Everybody is growing corn. There's way too much corn. You can't get it to market because the roads are just being improved. So what do you do with it? You distill it into whiskey, which is very easy to transport. Whiskey was cheaper than almost anything else. You could get a gallon of fairly decent whiskey for 40 cents at the time, which was pretty cheap even at that time. A bushel of corn cost you 25 cents, so almost as cheap as corn. The average farm, a 100-acre farm, produced about 4,000 bushels of corn or wheat. There was no place to ship it. You couldn't do it. How many wagon loads did you need? But you could turn it into whiskey, and then you had a wagon load that you could take. In Kentucky, they talked about Kentucky breakfast was, quote, 3 shots of whiskey and a chew of tobacco. Number 2, it is patriotic. It is made in America. Tea and coffee were imported. They were expensive. They were foreign, and they were British. Coffee was just coming in, by the way, because it's African in origin. Wine, that's a European thing. Thomas Jefferson tried to get Americans hooked on wine. He failed. Grape growing, wild grapes, yes, but domestic grapes, wine grapes, not very successful for a long time. Beer comes later because the Germans came later. And it was considered a German thing. Today, of course, it's universal. It was bulky. It cost money to ship, and because it was basically bottled in barrels, not in cans or bottles, it spoiled much faster. You could keep whiskey for decades. Drugs are an interesting thing. Why not drugs? Marijuana was known. Everybody grew it in their garden, but it was for medicinal reasons. Opium just coming in at this time. China was pretty much closed up until this time, so opium was not very common. It was expensive, and you could only get it from doctors. And also, drugs are not American. Drugs, most of them at the time, made you passive, knocked you out, or made you very passive. Alcohol made you talkative and aggressive. Which is more American? And most people came to the same conclusion at the time. The other reason, of course, whiskey, distilled alcohol, is one of the few safe things to drink. It is easy, it is cheap. The water, most places by now, is polluted, is not safe to drink. Wherever you are, there's probably somebody peeing upstream or livestock upstream. So you could get very sick from polluted water and dirty water. Many people at the time believed water was very unhealthy to drink, and probably was. Ben Franklin, he's being sarcastic here, if God had intended men to drink water, he would not have made him with an elbow capable of raising a wine glass. But pretty sound reasoning. Milk, no pasteurization. Milk can and did kill a number of people. Not available in winter because you have to have a calf to produce the milk. And depending on what the cow ate, could also poison the cow and you. Cider, all over the place. Lots of apple trees. Lots of cider. It was fermented into hard cider, about 10% alcohol, but basically a northern drink. And again, you can't keep it forever. It would keep for a while, but eventually it turned into apple cider vinegar. So the only thing that would keep that was pure, that was consumable, was alcohol, distilled alcohol. There are solutions for the problems of alcohol. This is the beginning of not prohibition, but temperance, the American Temperance Society. Prohibition was eliminating alcohol. Temperance was to temper or moderate the use of alcohol. The first temperance organization starts 1826. I don't care about the date, but this is the big date of 1830s, 1840s of temperance. It is a reform movement. Thousands of clubs, over 1 million members, largely controlled and led by women who saw right away they're the ones that get abused by drunken husbands, and the connection to poverty. Something like 80-90% of poverty at the time, and a lot of it today, connected to alcohol abuse. Partially successful at the time. The use did decline before the Civil War. How did they do this? They created quote unquote dry areas where no alcohol could be sold. They couldn't prohibit making it in your barn, but not selling it did cut down the consumption. Before the Civil War, there are 12 states that have dry laws. And they sent out millions of pamphlets, literally to every house in the country, arguing against the evils of alcohol. Of course, when the Civil War comes around, that whole thing goes down the drain. People drink during the war. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and we will go on to talk about abolition, which was the, as they called it, the queen of the reform movements that swallowed up all of the attention and all of the work that people put into other movements. Stay safe. Take care out there.